In 1750, the idea of a single unified America didn't really exist yet. What you had was this long 1,200-mile ribbon of British territory right along the Atlantic coast.
Right, with about 1.5 million people, officially. But the key thing to understand is that life there was not one single experience.
Not at all. I mean, if we could drop you right into one of those 13 settlements, your entire world, how you lived, what you ate, who governed you, it would all depend on which of the three big regions you landed in.
That geographical structure is probably the most important thing to get about colonial life in 1750. You had the Atlantic Ocean on one side, which was their connection to everything.
Trade, people, news.
Exactly. And on the other side, you had this massive, basically immovable natural wall, the Appalachian Mountains.
And that wall is so critical. It wasn't just, a bunch of hills. It was a serious barrier that really limited how far west people could go.
It forced everyone to cluster along the coast and near the big rivers. All of life farming, trade, everything was pointed east, back toward the sea.
And for Great Britain, this territory was incredibly valuable. We're not just talking about land for people to live on.
No, we're talking about a massive source of resources. Millions of acres of dense forests meant high-quality timber. And that wood wasn't just for building colonial homes.
It was for building ships, specifically ships for the British Navy, which was, the key to their global power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Crown didn't just see colonists, they saw a giant protected supply chain.
So Britain essentially carved up this whole territory based on what the environment could give them, right? Stretching from New France, which is modern-day Canada, down to Spanish Florida.
Right. And that's what we should dig into, because that division created three totally different lifestyles, economies, and even cultures, like three separate worlds flying the same flag.
Okay, let's start in the north. We've got the New England Colonies, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. If you're a farmer there, what's your biggest challenge?
Oh, the climate, without a doubt. The winters were long, cold, and snowy. That meant a really short growing season.
And the soil was terrible, wasn't it?
Famously rocky. Glaciers had scraped it thin thousands of years before. You just couldn't grow huge fields of profitable crops like wheat.
So farming, there had to be what's called subsistence farming. Can you break that down?
Yeah, it just means you're growing enough food for your own family to subsist on, to survive.
Yeah.
Maybe a little extra to trade with a neighbor. You weren't growing a big surplus to sell overseas for profit.
So if you can't make money from the land, you've got to pivot. What did New England do?
They turned to the two things they had in abundance, the sea and the forests. They became expert fishermen, hauling in massive amounts of cod, and they became the best shipbuilders in the world.
Because they had all that high-quality timber right there.
Exactly. That, plus deep natural harbors, made them the perfect place to build ships.
And this focus on the sea and on small, self-sufficient farms also shaped how their towns were built.
It did. The towns were built close together, very compact, usually around one central building.
The meeting house.
The meeting house, yeah. And it served two functions. Religion was incredibly important, of course, but it was also the center of their political life.
This is where they had their famous town meetings.
Right. This is a form of direct democracy. Citizens would gather to debate and vote directly on local laws, on budgets, on things that affected their daily lives.
And to do that, you need people who can, read and understand the issues, which is why education was such a big deal there.
Absolutely. New England started some of the first public schools. The main reason was so children could read the Bible, but it also created a population that could participate in that local government. It's a level of civic engagement you just didn't see elsewhere.
Okay, so now let's head south to the middle colonies. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. This area had a great nickname.
The breadbasket.
And for very good reason.
A very accurate name. Unlike New England, the soil here was fantastic, super fertile. The climate was much more moderate, so they could grow massive amounts of what we call cash crops.
Things like wheat, corn, and rye.
Exactly. Grains. These weren't just for your family. This was stuff you could sell for a big profit.
But to sell it, you have to get it to a port. What advantage did they have to make that happen?
Two huge navigable rivers, the Hudson and the Delaware. They were like natural superhighways. It was easy and cheap to float all that grain from the farms down to port cities like New York and Philadelphia.
And speaking of those cities, they were booming. That kind of trade requires more than just farmers.
Oh, for sure. All that wealth created a huge demand for skilled craftsmen. Blacksmiths, silversmiths, printers, tailors, you name it. This created a really strong middle class, which just made the cities grow even faster.
But what's really fascinating about the Middle Colonies is the mix of people there,
Yeah, it was incredibly diverse for the time. You had people from all over Europe. Dutch, Swedes, Germans, Scots-Irish, English.
which created a different kind of society.
Yeah,
Right.
but
Well,
more tolerant. Much more. Thanks in large part to groups like the Quakers in Pennsylvania, there was a level of religious and cultural tolerance you just didn't find in, say, the very strict Puritan society up in New England.
okay. Which brings us to our third world, the Southern Colonies. Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Here, one word comes to mind. Scale.
Scale and climate.
Hmm?
It's warm, it's humid, and the soil is incredibly fertile. That gives you a really long growing season, maybe 9 or 10 months out of the year.
And that climate is perfect for a few very specific, very valuable crops.
Right. In Virginia and Maryland, the big one was tobacco. It sold for huge prices back in England. And then further south, in the swampy lowlands, it was all about rice and indigo.
Indigo, that's the plant that used to make blue dye, right?
That's the one. And all of these crops, tobacco, rice, indigo, they all required constant, difficult, back-breaking labor.
Which leads directly to the development of the plantation system.
Correct. We're talking about massive farms, almost like self-sufficient little towns. And to work them, they relied on an enormous workforce, which was tragically filled by the forced labor of enslaved people brought from Africa.
And this system created a totally different society from the North. It really concentrated wealth and, crucially, political power.
Absolutely. A small number of powerful planter families owned the best land and controlled the labor. They essentially formed an oligarchy that ran everything in the South.
And you didn't see as many big cities in the South, did you?
No, because the plantations were so self-sufficient. They often had their own docks on a river, so ships from England could sail right up to their property to load up with tobacco or rice. There wasn't the same need for a central port like Philadelphia.
So you have these three radical different regions. How did the British government in London try to manage all of this?
Well, that's where things start to get really interesting, and where the seeds of future conflict were planted. Officially, the king appointed a governor for each colony to represent his interests.
But the colonists got to elect their own local assemblies. And these assemblies had one very specific, very important power.
They had the power of the purse. They passed local laws, sure, but most importantly, they controlled all tax spending.
So the governor, who works for the king, can't even get paid unless the elected assembly agrees to it.
Exactly. It was a huge check on the king's power and gave the colonists this early, powerful taste of political independence and self-government.
But that government wasn't for everybody. Who actually got to vote?
The rules were strict. Generally, you had to be a white man and you had to own land. The idea was that property owners had a real stake in the community's success.
We saw how that worked in New England with their town meetings. That's direct democracy. But what was London's general attitude toward all this?
For the most part, London's approach was hands-off. It's sometimes called salutary neglect. Basically, as long as the colonies were loyal and, most importantly, profitable, London let them manage their own local affairs.
And that profitability was the whole point of the main economic theory of the time. Mercantilism, what is that?
Mercantilism is the belief that a colony exists for one reason and one reason only: to make the mother country wealthy.
So how does that work in practice?
It's a closed loop. The colonies provide cheap raw materials, lumber, tobacco, iron to Great Britain. Then Britain's factories turn those materials into finished goods, like furniture or clothing.
And then they sell those expensive finished goods right back to the colonists.
Exactly. Britain buys low and sells high. It's designed to pull wealth out of the colonies and into Britain. And to enforce this, they passed laws called the Navigation Acts.
Which basically said the colonies could only trade with England.
Right. No trading with the French or the Dutch, even if they offered better prices. And as you can imagine, colonial merchants were not happy about this.
Which led to a lot of creative solutions.
It led to a lot of smuggling, yes. Merchants would bring in French molasses or Dutch tea illegally to get around the English taxes and restrictions.
But even with all that, if you stood on the docks in Boston or Charleston in 1750, you'd see a ton of activity.
All the harbors were packed. Despite the restrictions, the trade network was making the colonies very wealthy. It was a controlled system, but it was a booming one.
Let's shift from that big economic picture down to the daily life of a regular family. And life was just physically hard.
That's putting it mildly. The family was the workforce. Your house was probably made of wood, and your only source of heat and your only way to cook was a big fireplace that had to be going all the time.
And you had to make almost everything yourself, right? Because buying things from England was so expensive.
Total self-sufficiency was the goal, and the roles were very, very clear. Women were in charge of the domestic world, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, making soap and candles, preserving food. It was endless, intense work.
While the men and boys were out in the fields or in the workshop from sunrise to sunset.
Your entire day was ruled by sunlight. There's no electricity, so when the sun goes down, you're pretty much done. People went to bed early and got up at dawn.
And even something as simple as getting water was a major chore.
A huge chore. No plumbing. Every single drop of water for drinking, cooking, washing there. It all had to be carried by hand from a well or a stream.
And this tough life was organized into a pretty clear social structure.
A very clear hierarchy, yeah. At the very top, you had the gentry. These were the super elite, the wealthy southern planters, the most successful city merchants. They lived in huge homes and wore expensive imported clothes to show off their status.
Then below them, you have the middle class, which was the biggest group.
Right. These are your independent farmers who own their land, shopkeepers, skilled artisans. They own property, they can vote. Then you had the poor whites, who were laborers or tenant farmers who didn't own land and had very little power.
And we also have to distinguish between two types of unfree labor. First, indentured servants.
Right. An indentured servant was usually a poor person from Europe who wanted to come to America but couldn't afford it. So they'd sign a contract to work for someone for, say, 4 to 7 years.
In exchange for their passage over.
Exactly. After their time was up, they were free. Their servitude was temporary.
Which is a stark contrast to the very bottom of the social ladder. Enslaved Africans.
A total contrast. Enslaved people were considered property. They had no rights. Their labor was forced, their status was passed down to their children, and their servitude was for life. There was no end to it.
Now, in terms of culture, we mentioned religion was central everywhere, but did that look different from place to place?
It did. Most colonists were Protestants, and church was a huge part of social life. But again, the middle colonies were the most diverse. They were a safe place for Quakers, Lutherans, even some Catholics and Jewish people.
And what about education? How did most kids learn?
For most people, it was pretty basic. You learn at home, maybe you went to a small one-room school, or you became an apprentice to learn a trade like carpentry or printing.
But the wealthy did it differently.
Especially in the South, where people were so spread out. Wealthy families would hire private tutors to teach their sons things like Latin, advanced math, and literature.
And by 1750, there were a few colleges. Who were they for?
They were mostly for training young men for two specific professions, to become lawyers or to become ministers.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the pressures of growth. As colonists pushed west for more land, they ran right into the people who were already living there.
Right, the Native American tribes.
Yeah.
And conflict was almost constant.
But it wasn't always just fighting, was it? There was also trade and diplomacy.
For sure. Powerful groups like the Iroquois and the Cherokee engaged in a lot of trade. They would trade furs and skins for European goods like metal tools, guns, and blankets. They were smart political and economic players.
But the Europeans also brought something with them that was unintentionally catastrophic.
Disease, things like smallpox and measles. The Native American populations had zero immunity to these European diseases, and they were wiped out by the thousands. It was devastating.
And any treaties that were signed to set boundaries, they didn't seem to last long.
No. The pressure from colonists for more land was relentless. Treaties were broken all the time, which just led to more conflict and pushed Native American tribes further and further west.
Meanwhile, back on the coast, the colonial cities were just exploding.
They were booming. Philadelphia was the largest and probably the most modern city in North America. Boston was the big shipping center. New York was the diverse trading port. And Charleston was the key hub for all that rice and indigo coming out of the South.
What would it feel like to walk through one of those cities?
Busy, noisy, crowded streets full of horses and carts. And you'd always have the threat of fire. All those wooden buildings packed so close together, it was a constant danger.
And getting from one of those cities to another was a real challenge.
Travel was awful. There were hardly any paved roads, just dirt paths that turned into rivers of mud when it rained. A 50-mile trip could easily take you several days.
So if you had to go a long distance, you'd take a boat.
Absolutely. Traveling by water along the coast or on a big river was much faster and more comfortable. And this slow travel meant communication was slow too. A letter from England could take months to arrive.
Which is why local places like taverns were so important.
They were the information hubs. Travelers would stop and share news from other towns or from overseas. It was the main way information got around.
So to sum it up, by 1750, the 13 colonies were really this collection of three very different worlds, all connected by this strict economic relationship with Britain, and all built on hard labor and a rigid social structure.
And the thought to leave you with is this. Think about how these deep regional differences, the industrial north, the farming middle, the plantation south, could possibly come together. What they all shared, though, was this long tradition of governing themselves. And that's what would be tested in the years to come.
Good luck with your studies.